Thanks a lot for the opportunity to give my talk here. So I would like to present you some results that are preliminary work about the deformation and textural evolution of ophicarbonates in subduction zones. And this is a continuation that emerged out of my previous PhD thesis, and it has been done in collaboration with several people from Spain, so Garrido and others. You might wonder, why do we care about ophicarbonates? Because they are not very common, at least not as common as metasediments and mafic rocks, and they have been studied quite a lot in past decades. But I hope I can convince you that we can still learn a lot from them, in particular about devolatilization mechanisms in general. So ophicarbonates, they form by interaction of low temperature serpentinization fluids that are alkaline and have contained calcium with seawater, and those precipitate calcium carbonates in the serpentinites anywhere where serpentinites or peridotites are exhumed to the seafloor, such as slow spreading ridges or along transform spots. And these ophicarbonates, they have a very simple chemistry that can be expressed in this ternary diagram: calcium, magnesium, silica, and ophicalcites, just having a mixture of calcite and antiquarite, they form along this trend. And if you consider the end members of these compositions, you see that these ophicarbonates will be very volatile rich, spanning from 14 weight % of water in the serpentine and maybe to 44 weight % of CO2. And this makes them interesting to study because they are, of course, a large volatile reservoir, not as common as other rocks, but a very concentrated volatiles that will go down into the subduction zone, and these volatiles will be later released and contributing to geochemical cycling. And ophicarbonates, they are, of course, in direct contact to serpentinites. And as I hope most of you know, the serpentinite dehydration to Chl-harzburgite releases a large fluid pulse at around 650 degrees, which is a subarc depth in most subduction zones, which is one of the most important fluid pulses for chemical transport from the slab to the overlying mantle and arc volcanoes. So the ophicarbonates give us an opportunity to indirectly study the release of serpentinite fluids, but also the opportunity to study the contribution of carbon in serpentinites to geochemical cycling and to the devolatilization mechanism in general. And I want to focus here in this study, our, let's say, ultimate goal is to improve our understanding of the interplay of metamorphic devolatilization, dissolution precipitation, crystal growth, fluid flow, deformation, and tectonic stress. Because all these parameters contribute to the mechanism of devolatilization, but the interdependencies we are not very sure about yet, and we have to get a better understanding. In the Alps, there are several meta-ophicarbonates exposed that are in high pressure subducted examples. But as you can see here in this PT section of serpentinites, they are mostly hosted in the serpentinite stability field. So here I want to take you to two examples from southern Spain in the Nevado-Fila-Bede complex, which is within the internal zone of the Betic Cordillera. And these examples are the Milagrosa ophicarbonates that are hosted in serpentinite, and the Almirez meta-ophicarbonates, which is hosted in chloride-harzburgite, so the dehydration product of serpentinite. And these complexes, these ultramafic complexes, experience subduction in the early Miocene to Pliocene, and really fast exhumation in a core complex that preserve their prograde and peak conditions and structures. So let's go to the field. Here we see a serpentinite in Milagrosa with carbonate lenses, and these are different ophicarbonates. Here I distinguish them into calcite marbles, diopside dolomite marbles that occur more in the contacts, and then towards serpentinite, antiquarite, diopside dolomite rocks. And these are, in this compositional diagram, really nicely plotted along the antiquarite calcite trend. These are, by the way, results that we have shown in the 2019 paper in Journal of Metamorphic Geology. But you will need the background when we go a step further to the fabric analysis and tectonic evolution. In Almirez, we see meta-ophicarbonates lenses that are hosted in chloride-harzburgite, And they have nice metamorphic structures of granophalsic, meta-ophicarbonates, and also gneissic rocks. And they also have this compositional variability along this trend. From our previous study, we determined the PT conditions by the mineral assemblage. And in Almirez, we see an olivine diopside dolomite titano-clinohumide rock with chloride and with abundant aragonite inclusions, both in olivine and diopside. And this constrains us the PT conditions in this PT pseudosections for meta-ophicarbonates to about 1.8 at 680 degrees. And this fits nicely to the PTT path that is constrained for this complex from meta-rodingites and for the serpentinites. The one example on Milagrosa is the lower grade. Here we have antigorite stable and no olivine, which places us roughly in this field, but the pressure is less well constrained. For the metamorphic evolution, there is one really important devolatilization reaction in these rocks, and that happens at 580 degrees roughly, which is the reaction of antigorite together with calcium carbonate to form olivine diopside dolomite chloride and releasing a water-rich CO2-bearing fluid. In this TX-CO2 diagram, you see that this reaction occurs at this pseudo-invariant point 1 at low XCO2. And from the thermodynamic models, we predict that if there the fluid composition is internally buffered, then the rock should follow this pseudo-invariant line with both calcium carbonate and dolomite stable in the rock. And that is what we see at Almirez. In contrast, if we should have a lot of fluid infiltration of serpentinite dehydration that releases a lot of carbon from the meta-ophicarbonates, then we should get calcium-rich, olivine-rich rocks, but we don't see those. So in our study, we had concluded that there was limited infiltration. So for the fabrics, we see really interesting patterns that I would like to show you now, because there are also some open questions about them. And I will show you for that several pole figures. These are lower hemisphere plots of the crystallographic orientations acquired by EBSD. And you see here that always the distribution of the crystallographic axes, and in relation as a reference, I give the foliation plane that we measured in field as this line and the pole to the foliation as the square. And in Milagrosa, the lower grade meta-ophicarbonates, we see that the serpentinite surrounding these carbonate lenses has a strong maximum of the C-axis that coincides with the pole to the foliation. And this is what we would expect for a sheet silicate that deforms by basal glide, when the C-axis defines the basal plane defines the foliation. What's more interesting is when we go towards the carbonate lenses, so with increasing carbonate content, here we have some serpentinite lenses still available, but still preserved, but we have more carbonate. We see also crystallographic preferred orientation in diopside and dolomite, and roughly the C-axis of dolomite coincides with the pole to the foliation, and also the 100 axis of diopside coincides with this orientation. And this fabric becomes stronger in the carbonate-rich rocks. Here we see the same crystallographic orientation also for calcite. Interestingly, in Almirez, the meta-ophicarbonates, where antigorite is not stable anymore, we see the same pattern of crystallographic orientations with respect to the foliation plane. So from this, we can already get one first order conclusion or an interpretation that possibly these patterns, so for sure these patterns are related. We have a similar process, and possibly what we see in the Almirez case, where no antigorite is stable, we still see this, this fabric preserved from the precursor antigorite phase. Crystallographic preferred orientations, they are typically interpreted as a result of dislocation creep, so crystal plasticity. But here we have a problem to reconcile these patterns with crystal plasticity, because diopside is typically stronger than carbonates. So carbonates deform at lower temperatures already, but we have the same crystal preferred orientation and also a strong crystal preferred orientation in diopside. So to get more insights, we did cathodoluminescence imaging. So you see here two images for Milagrosa and Almirez meta-ophicarbonates. And the CL images, they show concentric zoning in diopside and dolomite. So here diopside in green. This is likely due to different manganese content, small variations in manganese, and in dolomite, which may also be due to different iron contents. And what we see here is that the zoning is cut, truncated, and also some cores of diopside, they are resorbed, and then there are fingers of the rim diopside growing into it. And from these observations, we can deduce that the deformation mechanism likely was diffusion creep by dissolution precipitation and not dislocation creep, which would obliterate these zoning patterns. When we directly compare the CL images with the EBSD phase maps, we see that here in the phase map, you see aragonite inclusions in red. And we see that these occur in all the different zones in diopside. So they are in the cores, in these darker cores, but also in the lighter rims, which tells us that we have two or more prograde growth stages or continuum of diopside in the aragonite stability field at a high pressure. And that also tells us that the crystal preferred orientations that we had measured in EBSD, that they are a prograde feature and not a retrograde deformation overprint of the carbonates. What we also see is that we have radial misorientations in diopsides, and these are also typically not indicative of dislocation creep, but for other mechanisms. So to conclude, to have some first conclusions and implications, we can speculate that the crystal preferred orientations are likely caused by oriented crystal growth due to anisotropic fluid flow in the reacting ophicarbonate, possibly in addition to a topotactic relationship between precursor anticoride and the product carbonate and diopside. And down here you see a small sketch of ophicalcite, and we would predict that these calcite anticoride mixtures, they deform already at temperatures lower than 550 degrees, and volatilization event in ophicarbonate will occur at 550 to 600 degrees. And here we release a lot of fluid from the reaction of anticoride to form diopside and olivine. And this fluid may induce a transformation weakening and the deformation by dissolution precipitation. Then when this reaction occurred, we have a compacted ophicarbonate rock that has this higher rock strength compared to serpentinite. So at higher temperatures, when serpentinite will dehydrate to Chl-harzburgite, these meta-ophicarbonates may be shielded, less permeable, and fluid may focus along the interface. And so these ophicarbonates may be a mechanism where rheology helps to preserve the ophicarbonate lenses and helps them to be transported further down into the subduction zone, what we also predicted from thermodynamic modeling.
2 minutes.
So that's it from me, and I'm happy to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments if there's time.
Perfect timing. Yeah, so is there any, there's questions coming in. So from Tim Johnson, what would you say was a normal overall abundance of primary ophiocarbonates and serpentinites? 1%, less?
So in general, overall on the world, or in these specific cases? Because
I think he means the world, but
overall in the world.
Overall.
So this is this is relatively little. There are some big examples from the Iberian margin and from the Alps, where these ophicarbonate layers can be up to 150 meters thick, and they can contain really high concentrations of carbon. But if you count also the fast spreading ridges and make the abundance calculation, then the overall abundance is low, maybe 1% or less. There's a paper from Alt et al. Where they did such a calculation from Jeff Alt, 2012.
Excellent.
But what we see here, I think what is interesting And what I forgot to tell, these patterns of dissolution precipitation and the weakening during reaction, that also has been seen in mafic rocks. There was a recent paper by Holger Stünitz et al., where they showed a similar zonation patterns by cathodoluminescence, and implying that there is probably a high importance of this dissolution precipitation in most subduction zones where we have a lot of fluid available.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.